For the today's session, we are going to talk about developing multi-tenant applications using Postgres row level security. Yeah. So let's talk about tenant first. So what is a tenant? Tenant is like a group of users belonging to a particular organization, or simply you can say it is a customer. So traditional applications were single tenant, where a single software runs on a server and it serves a single client. Okay. So this is useful when you want to have very high data isolation. So consider a banking application, you want a high security and high data isolation. So traditionally single tenant applications were developed for such scenarios. uh, then people started developing multi-tenant applications. So what is a multi-tenant? So multi-tenant is like a single software which serves multiple tenants, and the tenant uh, can be onboarded on a single application, and each tenant can use it. So the resources are shared between multiple tenants. So the usage or the advantage of this is we have a better usage of resources, as we have um, a resource which is shared between multiple tenants, and it is also cost effective. So if you consider a single tenant application, in that we have to uh, suppose we have 10 clients and we have to deploy the application for 10 tenants. So in that case we would have to deploy everything right from the server and the database and other resources for each of the tenants. So the cost is high for the single tenant application, but if you consider the multi-tenant application, the cost is low as the resources and the application is shared between multiple tenants. Also it is easily manageable and the upgrades are easy. So if you can think about the releases, you do not have to update each of the tenant softwares. You have to update only a single application for the if we have a multi-tenancy. So the updates are easy as well for the multi-tenant applications. Um, there are three patterns which are used mainly for the multi-tenant applications. First is the database per tenant pattern, second is the schema per tenant pattern, and third is the shared database with discriminator column pattern. So let's talk about in short in about all the three. First, take the database per tenant pattern. So database per tenant pattern is like you have a database separate for each of the tenant. So if you have 10 tenants, you will have 10 databases. So if you need high data isolation, you can use database per tenant pattern.
But there can
Okay.
be some cases, Ankit, right, where the tenant itself won't, for the data security reasons, he wants all its infra to be in a separate server side. That depends on the as a requirement from the
Right.
tenant itself. In that case, we have to use this solution. There is no other way. But otherwise,
Yeah.
this multi-tenancy solution is good enough.
Yeah. Yeah. So it depends on the applications how we want to design, and also the client. If they want complete isolation, you have to go for the single tenant design pattern. Okay. The second pattern we have is the schema per tenant pattern. Here, instead of creating a database for each tenant, we create a schema for each tenant. Okay. The third pattern is shared database with discriminator column pattern. Here we have a shared database for all the tenants, and what we do here, we use a column to identify a data of each tenant. So for example, consider a users table. Here we store the users of all the tenants. So how will you identify a data of a particular tenant? You need to store a column which will identify a data. So it will identify to which tenant a particular users belong. So that column is called the discriminator column. Mainly or the majorly it is named as tenant ID. Okay, so we will talk about more on this. The session is mainly for the shared database with discriminator and column pattern. We will talk in more detail in the coming slides. So about the shared database with discriminator column pattern, as I said, we have a table where we store the identifier of the tenant. Here is the tenant ID, and you can see here we have two tenants data. So tenant 1 and tenant 2. The first two users with ID 1 and 2 belongs to tenant 1, and 3 and 4 belongs to tenant 2, and 51 and 76 belongs to tenant 1 again. So we store the all the users in a single table, and we have a identifier for the tenant. So when to use this pattern? So this is mainly used when we do not have a very we do not want a high isolation, and also we do not want a high complexity, and also we want to have easy updates, and we also want to onboard new tenants. So if you see here, if you want to update the software, what we have to do, you only have to have a migration script which will update the schema, and the application can run. So if you consider this for some other consider this with other pattern. So if you compare with the database per tenant pattern, in database per tenant pattern you would have to update all the databases, and in for schema pattern you will have to update all the schema. So the it is not easily manageable. So if you see, if you compare the database and schema pattern, these two are not easily manageable, but this pattern, the shared uh, tenant ID column pattern, is easy. Okay, so also it is easy to onboard new tenants. So if you see for the database per tenant pattern, if you want to onboard a new tenant, you would have to create a database, and you would have to create all the schemas. But if you compare this with this single database pattern, it is easy. You can easily onboard it. You only have to insert the data in some tables, and the tenants get onboarded. Okay, so you can use this for startups. We do not need a very high data isolation. Consider for the non-banking applications. There are two ways to implement this pattern. Mm, First is at the code level, and other is at the database level. So in code level, what you do is you create filter for each queries on the shared table. So if you have consider a users table, you can use the filter. Whenever we try to get the data from that user table, you will add a filter, and the data will be fetched accordingly.
So, Ankit, filter means you are talking about condition in the way clause, right? That is what you are talking about.
Right, right. So for example, take the same example of the users table. You want to fetch data of tenant 1. So what you would do, the SQL query would be like select star from users where tenant ID equals to 1. So in all the queries where you want to get the data of a particular tenant, you would have to add the filter such as tenant ID equals to 1. So you have to add it in all the queries. Or you can use a framework like Hibernate, where you can use some annotations and add filter, but it also has some loopholes. So for the bulk queries, it does not work properly. You will have to close the find all queries and write your own implementation. So there are chances that you may leak data in this. It's not completely secure. So a better approach would be to have it at the database level. What you can do, you can use row level security policies. So you do not have to write the filters in your code level. You have to create the policies and the database level, and the data is fetched accordingly. Okay, is this clear till now? Yeah, I guess yes.
Yeah, there is
uh,
no question so far, Ankit. I think it's clear to the people. Guys, if you have
okay,
any doubt, please feel free to ask the question in the chat window.
yeah. So what is Postgres row level security? So the row level security is a general term, but we have considered the Postgres row level security as part of the demo. So what is row level security? Row level security is a fine grain access control feature where you can filter the data according to some conditions. So here we can have a condition like the user should belong to a particular tenant. It can also differ. You can add multiple conditions in the policies, and the data gets fetched accordingly. So about the row level security, there are some conditions that you need to take care. Row level security is not applied on a super users and the table owners. So the Postgres users that we have by default in the Postgres database, you cannot apply the row level security on those users because they are admin users. But you can enforce the row level security on the tables owner. It is not enabled by default, but you can enforce them. So there are two ways to implement row level securities. What you can do, you can create a database user for each tenant, and you can use this user in the row level security policies. So what you can do, if you have 10 tenants, you can have 10 database users, and whenever a request comes for a particular tenant, you use the database for that tenant and you try to fetch the queries. So in the policies you can use this current user, which is provided by Postgres, uh, to filter the data. Okay, another way is you can use the session parameters, and you can use the session parameters in the row level security policies. So we will talk about this in the next slide. So this is just an example of one of the policies using session parameters. So this is creating a policy on tenants. So the policy is named tenant users isolation policy. uh, this is on table users, and what the condition is, the condition is the tenant id, this tenant id in users table should match with the parameters that we have passed. So the current setting is provided by Postgres. It is like you can set some parameters in the Postgres for the session level. So once you create those variable in the session level, those are accessible for the entire session. So what the condition here is, the tenant id should match with the parameter. So if a particular row is matched with the condition, that row is fetched, otherwise the data is not fetched. Okay, it is similar to what we have as a filter when you write where tenant id equals to 1. This is similar, but
Ankit, we
here
have a
we are
question
using.
from you're like with RLS, we still require tenant
Mhm.
ID in the shared tables, right? So with
Yeah,
RLS
yeah,
also we need a tenant ID in all the tables which are shared across the tenants.
right, we need that because we have to identify the data for a particular tenant. So how we can identify? We need a column there. Only then we can identify the data of a particular tenant. Okay, so we need to have
So Ankit, you also said
structure.
that the Postgres gives this creating this policy as a feature, right? Does other database do we have this row level security feature in the database also?
Yeah, Microsoft SQL Server has this feature. Others do not have that yet. The modern database have.
So, for example,
Uh,
MySQL, right? That which is mostly used in uh,
yeah,
in application the productions. Does MySQL has this feature?
MySQL does not have it. They have planned it
Okay,
quite earlier, but they have not developed it yet.
okay.
Yeah.
So guys, we
So
are
this.
going to have a demo after this presentation, right? So if something is not clear, how are we going to do this setting? We are going to have this demo, which will make things very clear to you. What what these settings are, how we apply these settings, and how how the filtering is going to happen. We'll have a demo to present all these things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We can start the demo now. I think the theory is complete, we can take a look at the demo.
Sure, Ankit, let's do one more thing, right? When we present the demo, let's try to map the demo with the PPT as well, so that people understand where did we presented what thing, right? So that they can map the
Right,
things.
right. So I have two connections here. So if you see the PG admin here, I have two connections. One is for the admin user and one is for the application user. So what I have done is I have used the Postgres users, which is the admin user here, and I have created another user which is named the application user, and both are accessing the same database. They are accessing the RLS database. Okay. Uh, and as I said in this PPT, the RLS is not applied on super users and table owners. So if you see, this is the admin user. If I try to take a look, I have two main tables here. One is the tenants table. You can see I have two entries over here for the tenant 1 and tenant 2, and in users table you can see I have 7 entries. Some are for the tenant 1. You can see the first and second belongs to tenant 1, third and fourth belongs to tenant 2, and the rest all belongs to tenant 1. So we have a discriminator column here, which is tenant ID, which actually refers to the ID of the tenants. Okay. So here we have a shared database. So this is shared between multiple tenants, as you can see. And what I said here is we cannot apply the policy on super users. So as the policy is not applied, we can see the data of both the tenants here. Okay. But if we try to take a look at the application user, if you go into the use the application user, you can see again here I can access the tenants table because I have not applied the policy here, and as it is not required for the tenants table. But if you see here for the users table, you do not have any entries. Okay, because this user have not fulfilled the policy, so the rows uh, do not match the policy here. So the rows are, so there is no entry here. So what you can do, you need to fulfill the policy. So the policy is like we have here is,
Can you show the policy here, Ankit, in the database?
yeah, yeah. So if you can see, this is the policy, tenants user isolation policy, and what it checks is tenant ID should match the parameter here. So the name of the parameter is app.tenantID. Okay.
Okay.
So yeah. So what we can do, we can try to query the data here. So if we set this parameter, and then we try to fetch the data, we will get the all the users of tenant 1. If we try to change the user here, sorry, tenant here, we will get all the users of tenant 2. So we have used the policy here to filter the data. We can set the same using the code. So we can set this parameter and the rest all things will work as it is. So if consider if you have a single tenant application and you want to make it multi-tenant, what you have to do, you have to create the policies and you need to set the parameters from your code. So this parameter you can set it from a central level. You can create a component which actually does this. So if this is clear, I can go to the code level and I can show how we can do this.
So you mean to say, Ankit, here is like before querying our database, we have to set this tenant ID
Yeah,
so
yeah,
that the query that is running in the transaction is having this context as a tenant ID, and all the queries running in the transaction will have this tenant ID context and will have this filter automatically, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if you try to reset this parameter and then you try to fetch the data, as I said earlier, you won't get any data. So here you get a error because the policy is not getting fulfilled, but you can get empty data as well. You need to update the policy accordingly. But as I said, we can have what we have here is we have a much higher level of security as compared to the other patterns, the one with using the code level. Because if you someone forgets to add the clause here for the tenant ID, we won't get any data, the data won't be leaked. Okay, so there are chances that the result will be empty but we won't leak the data. Okay, but if you create a proper policies here, you will get proper results. Okay. So let's take a look at the application. This is a this application uses Java and Spring Boot uh, and Flyway for the migration. So uh, if you take a look at the code, we have used two user. One is Flyway. Is used for the database migration, and for the database migration we have used the Postgres user, which is the admin user. So this user can create the tables, and we can use another user, application user, which is actually used for the application. So if we have any queries, then we have to use the application users. As I said earlier, the super users, we do not apply, the policy is not applied on the super user, so you have to create an application users with some restricted access. So I have created this user, and uh, the code contains two scripts. One is for the structure of the database. It creates two tables, tenants and users. And in the second migration script we have created a policy, and the policy is same that I shown in the database. It checks for the tenant ID, and you need to enable the policy as well. So if you do not enable it, it won't be enforced, so you have to enable as well. Let's check the data source configuration. We have created two data source. One is for the Flyway and one is for the application. So this is using Hikari pool. Okay, you can use all the properties that we use traditionally for the Spring Boot applications. We are only manually configuring these two data sources here. So also we have a tenant context. So for the purpose of this application I have used a header x hyphen tenant hyphen id. This actually identifies the tenant, but if you check, if you try to implement this in your code, what you can do, you can use the security context or the user context. You can get the tenant id from the user rather than taking it as a request header. Okay, so we are storing the tenant context over here, and if I show you the two entities that we have here, one is the users entity and other is the tenants entity. Let's first look at the tenants entity. This is a simple entity which only has two columns, id and name. The other entity that we have is, it has some basic columns, but it has some other columns as well. So if you check this tenant our entity, it has a tenant id column. So this is the identifier or the discriminator column. Okay, and which actually refers to the tenant id of the tenants table. So if you check, we have a listener here. So why we require this? So suppose you want to create a new user. So what you can do, you can add a listener on all the entities which are extending tenant aware entity, because as we have a tenant id, we need to set it, and we do not want the developers to set it manually. We can have a central code. What it can do, it can take the id from the context and it can set the tenant ID for that entity. So whenever a new entity is getting saved, it will set the tenant ID from the tenant context. Let's check some other code. So this is for persisting the entity. The other logic that we have here is,
Can you focus more on the how the
yeah,
tenant ID is set in the context for
right,
the querying purpose, so that people, because that is our focus area, right? And people want to see more focus on that part.
right. So what we can do is, whenever we get any connection from the connection pool, and once you get a connection, so you can extend your delegating data source. What we have here is, we have some methods which we override. So uh, this has a method which says gets connection, so it gets the connection from the pool, and before returning the connection, what you can do, you can set the tenant ID. So the parameter that I showed you here uh, in the database, so this parameter we can set it explicitly whenever we get a connection. So whenever a query runs within a within for a connection, it will first set the tenant ID, and then it will run all the queries for afterwards. So suppose if you have a transaction where you have 2-3 database queries for a particular tenant. So consider you are fetching the user as well, you are fetching products as well. So if you have a table products, you are fetching products as well for a particular tenant. So before getting a connection from the pool, we can set the tenant ID. Once we set the tenant ID, all the queries which will run in the context of this particular tenant. So the queries that we will have is like this only, and it will explicitly use the policies to filter the data. Okay, so once this is set, you can write your code as it is. You do not have to uh, do write any filters on a particular repository or an entity. This is a central component where we are thing. Okay, and
So Ankit,
once you close,
what you are saying is, when you get a connection, just set the tenant ID as a context at that place only, and your other code base will be free from any tenant specific
right,
conditions, right? It will be just free from that condition, so that there is no where clauses in any of the query that is written in the code.
right. So I can show you that. So if you check the users, we do not have any annotation for the filter here as well. And if you check the uh, other repositories, such as the user repository, here you can see we do not have any filters on tenant. Okay, also if you check the code of the service layer, we have a get users method, and it actually uses the traditional find all method provided by GPA.
Okay.
So we are not extending it to add a filter, so we are not using filter anywhere. So
Okay.
this is the simple
What
logic.
about the tables that doesn't have any tenant specific information?
So they can run as it is, you do not need a context anywhere.
So this
Okay,
this setting this
so
context will not impact those queries. Is it the case?
no, yeah, it won't impact because you do not have any policy on the parameters, so the queries won't get impacted. So if you want to see, I can show you that this is the admin user, and if I try to set the parameter here, so if I write select star from users, and before doing it, I set app dot tenant underscore id equals to 1, and suppose we want to fetch from tenants, because tenants has do not have a policy here. So you are trying to discuss about this scenario, and if you try to run this query, it won't impact anything. So these are the simple variables. Even if you are not using it does not matter, the query will run as it is. So if the policies are using it, they will use it, otherwise it won't have any impact.
Okay. Does it also happen on the, for example, if I'm joining multiple tables to fetch a data, right? And maybe one
Mhm,
table has a tenant specific information, maybe two tables has a tenant specific information and one table doesn't have it. So
mhm.
does this tenant ID params uh, take into consideration for this join query as well and works perfectly well?
Yeah, so we can consider 2 3 scenarios. So consider one scenario where uh, you have a table where you have a tenant ID column, and we have some foreign reference to some other tables as well. So from that table we are referencing a products table as well, and we are referencing some other tables as well. So if the table or the reference table does not have any reference for the tenant ID, or we do not have any policy, so it can easily fetch the data as it is doing now. So if we have a join on the table, it won't have any impact because we do not have any policy. But if we have a table which has a policy on some of the column or a tenant ID column, then in that case when we join that table, it will explicitly apply the condition in the filter as well for the reference uh, column or the reference table. So it will add a filter in that case. So if you manually update the data in some of the tables and you try to explicitly set it incorrect, then what will happen, the data won't be fetched. You would get in your JPA that the entity does not exist because you have manually modified it and the policy does not match. So if you manually try to update a reference, you won't get that data.
Okay, let's go on. Let's move on.
Yeah, let's look at the two APIs that we have here. We have a get users API and the create users API. So in the get users API, you can provide a header x hyphen tenant hyphen id, which actually is used to set the context here. So if I show you again here, uh, tenant interceptor. So this code is actually taking the header in header
So
while
Ankit, we
setting
have
the
a
context.
question from one viewer, like what happens if I specify tenant ID close in my queries? So
Sorry, will you please repeat?
so what he's asking is what happens if I specify tenant ID close in my queries? So let's say if we have this condition also,
Mm-hmm.
or let's say in for a query, he doesn't to get while getting the connection, right? He doesn't set this tenant ID. Uh, in that case, we can still apply the tenant ID condition in our queries, right? That is simple. That is without this row level security.
Yeah, if you do not want to create a policy and you want to use it, you can use it. But if you create a policy and you do not pass the parameters, so you won't get any data.
Okay.
So this is similar to what I said earlier, that if you forgot to uh, set the parameter, you try to fetch the data. In that case, you won't get any data and the data won't leak.
Understood. So what that means is if we are using this uh, tenant ID condition in while getting the connection, right? Or even if you don't pass the tenant ID while getting the connection, data will not leak and we can't explicitly pass the condition.
Yeah, yeah. Even if you pass the condition there, it won't get you the data. So just for the example, uh, as you said here, if I go here and if I try to, so what I queried is select star from users. So even this is not getting you any data. Again, if you try to add a where clause, it won't get you any data. So I can show you that as well. Select star from users where tenant underscore id equals to 1. So you won't get any data here even if you pass the parameter. As the policy is not fulfilled, you won't get any data.
I think it is clear. Let's move on, Ankit.
Yeah, so we have two APIs. One is to get the user, another is to create the user. Here we are passing the header x-tenant ID. Here I have set it as 1. If you try to query, as you can see, I get 5 entries and all belongs to tenant 1. If I try to change it to tenant 2, I will get 2 users and both belongs to tenant 2. Okay, so we can create new user as well. So what
Let's
I
not
can
pass
do,
the tenant ID and try that.
so this is required for the application. If you do not pass it, you will get an
Okay.
error.
We have a
So
header validation.
yeah, we have header validation. So if you try to create a new tenant, for example, you create a user 6 here. So this is successful, and when you try to get, this is for tenant 2, I will get the data for tenant 1. You can see we have a user 6 for the tenant 1. Okay, so this is for the demo. If you have any questions, I can take it, or you have any doubts, I can show the code as well if you want. Have a look.
Anyone has any doubt?
Also the code is,
Please feel free to ping in the chat window. And there was two more comments from users that MariaDB and Oracle Virtual Private Data we also support similar things along
yeah,
with
yeah,
Postgres.
I think MariaDB has, yeah, yeah, MariaDB has their support. So I have committed all my code in this public repository. Feel free to use and try out. And I have readme as well. If you get stuck, you can ping me as well. Thank you, everyone.